McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation, helping to educate the public about the fundamental principles of their democracy and thus be in a position to help formulate public policy. The University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, hello, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and on this program, we're going to talk about social movements, mass movements, and what causes them. And to get us started, here's my co-host, Jim Falk, who will bring our two great experts in.
Good to see you, Dennis. And it's great to welcome Tom Shakman back to the show. He's a historian, social analyst, film and documentary maker. And I wish I had this in my bio. He states, "I consider myself fortunate that I always wanted to write, and I've been able to do so since my undergraduate days." And indeed, he has been able to. Worked at the National Geographic Society and CBS News. He's the author of over 30 books, and I'm sitting here with two of them. We spoke about Eric Hoffer a few weeks ago, American Iconoclast, The Life and Times of Eric Hoffer, and a fun book that he wrote recently, The Memoir of the Minotaur. So, Tom, great to have you back with us.
Thank you.
And joining us also is Professor Rory McVeigh. He's the Nancy Reeves Drew Professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Notre Dame. And he's also the director of the University Center for the Study of Social Movements. And he recently completed a 5-year term as co-editor of the American Sociological Review. I bet you were glad when you didn't have to do that anymore. And his recent work has focused on the social and political consequences of segregation. Among his books is The Rise of the Ku Klux Klan, Right-Wing Movements, and National Politics. Rory, nice to have you on the McCuistion Program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with you, because we did talk about mass movements about Eric Hoffer recently. But what is a social movement? What's the difference?
Well, a social movement would refer to people engaged in collective action, trying to bring about social change, doing it outside of the normal political institutions, such as voting or writing your congressperson or something like that. Usually protest, rallies, sit-ins, kind of unconventional tactics that are designed to put pressure on their opponents. Usually that's government, but sometimes they may be engaged in action against business or just trying to change society in other ways.
And does a social movement, Dennis and I both have come from business backgrounds where you have stages. Does a social movement go through certain stages from birth to its demise?
It can. Most social movements do ultimately die. Sometimes it's because they succeed. Sometimes it's because they fail. I think there's no set pattern where they will all follow the same path. But we do see cycles of protests where we'll have times where there'll be relatively little social movement activity, and then all of a sudden it seems like everything's going on, and there's all sorts of excitement in the streets.
So the civil rights movement, of course, was clearly one of the most important social movements, and I think of that as being social and political. Is that an accurate way to see it?
Yes, definitely. The social movement would definitely include political action, and usually they are targeted against the government, trying to address some sort of grievance, to address inequality, or sometimes to try to preserve inequality.
So before I turn it back over to you, Dennis, take the civil rights movement and briefly say what stages it might have gone through.
There was a long period where it was hard to enact serious change because there was so much stacked against African Americans in terms of the laws, in terms of resources that were available. But things did start to change with Brown versus Board of Education, with the urbanization of the Black population in the South, and the growth of a middle class. And you saw a strong movement emerging to take on, legal segregation in the South. And it started to decline as it found that it was more difficult to address ongoing economic inequality that continues to this day. We see a resurgence of interest in addressing civil rights, but taking on different issues than those that were engaged in the 1960s.
Okay, so before I come to Tom about some causes, what is there any one thing you can point to that causes social movements, or are they driven by just different issues?
The prevailing wisdom in the academic field, at least, is that in most cases, especially if you're talking about groups that are trying to address inequality, it's the lack of resources or the lack of a good political opportunity that's kind of holding back action that might otherwise take place. People are unlikely to take action if they don't have the capacity to bring about change. So often the inequality that they're trying to address may have been in existence for hundreds of years, but it was only when they're able to take effective action that you might see something happening.
I got it. Good. Now, Tom, as Jim referred to, we did a program recently with you on Eric Hoffer and mass movements. And we cannot assume that viewer saw that program a few minutes ago. So tell that viewer just briefly who Eric Hoffer was and the book he wrote called The True Believer about mass movements, sort of, in his opinion, what causes the kind of mass movements that he was talking about.
Well, first of all, Eric Hoffer lived a while ago. He died in 1983. His big book was published in 1951 when he was about 50. And it really involved his understanding as a layman of the similarities between Nazism and communism, which were much larger mass movements than what Rory was talking about. Not necessarily in terms of numbers, but in terms of the kinds of people that were involved. They didn't have one particular grievance, which is what Rory was talking about. But Hoffer's insight was that the sorts of people who went into these particular mass movements, who became the zealots, the true believers, were very, very similar, despite the difference in the political orientation of somebody who's a Nazi or somebody who's a committed communist. Social movements are sometimes enveloped in national movements or mass movement, but sometimes not. So I think Hoffer's insights on these are much broader and broad strokes that are not necessarily appropriate to look at for social movement, which generally have particular grievances, very particular, that need to be addressed.
Rory, one of the things that Dennis and I found so interesting is there's groups of people who really know all about Eric Hoffer and others say, who is this fellow? How is he viewed today in academia? Is he on your syllabus?
No. It's one of the things that's interesting. I enjoy hearing Tom talk about this because Hoffer is clearly a fascinating person. The way that we think about social movements or even mass movements, I think, is a reaction of the times. We react a lot to the times that we're living in. And in that earlier period, people were grappling with the rise of the Nazis and totalitarianism. And you see a lot of scholars trying to make sense of that. But decades later, as you see people coming out of their graduate schools having participated in the women's movement and the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, you see a very different kind of understanding of what draws people into activism or really into any type of social movement.
People today much more self-aware of themselves as parts of groups than they were during Hoffer's time. There's a greater sense of who one is, who you are in relation to the people around you, to the people who might be on the opposite side of a question. So it's a very different world, especially different also in terms of mass media and communications. We were, after all, in an era in 1951 when we didn't yet have color television, much less anything having to do with the internet and the immediacy of tremendous immediacy of today's communication and ability to spread ideas. That's really a whole new ballgame.
Well, I think you're right about the media, and of course we're part of that, but the social movements and social media, they use the same word for a reason, for sure. And Tom, I think that viewer might want to know that the civil rights movement was alive and well. We started thinking in the 60s, particularly with the Voting Act of 1965 and all that. And Hoffer had some opinions about the civil rights movement, and I don't think they were necessarily positive, were they?
No, they were not. He was very much of an individualist, and he felt that people should be able to make their way in the world by themselves, and that they didn't need any big group or anything to do anything for them. And he was, if you're okay, if you can work alongside of me on the docks, then you're fine. And I consider this to be his tremendous blind spot, that a man who was so sensitive to the needs of people who did not have things, and in many ways, to have a real blind spot about the civil rights movement. When I encountered that, I almost dropped my project, but I continued on because it's a fascinating guy, and he did have many other interesting things to say. But a biographer's obligation is to tell the truth, not to take a position on things. So one has to acknowledge a very bad blind spot in Hoffer in terms of civil rights movement, which I think has done tremendous things for America.
Well, let's stay on a sense on the civil rights movements, and what's taking place now strikes me as being social and political, and that's BLM, Black Lives Matter. Rory, just tell us what your thoughts are on that. What is it?
It's a lot more complicated than a lot of people think it is. A lot of people will try to put it in a box, thinking either that it's like the civil rights movement of the 1960s, or else it's a radical, violent organization, which it really isn't either of those. It is very much engaged with social justice, especially in terms of policing and police brutality. But it's advancing a broader range of issues. A lot of people don't recognize how important gender identity is to the Black Lives Matter movement in terms
How so?
of a lot of the founders and members and supporters are from the LGBTQ community, and they see a lot of oppression as being kind of multiform. They see oppressive structures affecting a lot of people, not just African Americans. And so there's this component to it that a lot of people don't understand.
What makes an effective leader of a social movement?
That's a really good question. And Black Lives Matter is an interesting case because they don't have a really centralized leadership. And so you have groups all over the country that are on the same page on some things, but acting differently on other things. I think—
Does that make it weaker?
There are trade-offs. There are strengths and weaknesses. I mean, there are, a lot of strengths that come from participation and democratic organization where everybody can contribute their ideas, but it can also be unruly at times and can sometimes make it hard to get everybody moving in the same direction. But I think finding the right balance between having an organization that's moving together, but also the freedom to welcome new ideas is probably the key.
Yeah, and Tom, the issue that we talked about on mass movements with Hoffer was the idea that people who are, let's just say, not satisfied with their own selves, they have issues of their own. They can't sort of see the future that they have, they don't particularly like. The other side of, so to speak, the Black Lives Matter thing was the, let's just say, white supremacist movement, the neo-Nazi movement. We've done some programs on these subjects, and I've watched these people. There was a great Frontline series on PBS recently, and they talked about the problems that they had with losing their freedoms, the problem that they had with big government. And their response, of course, is the kind of thing that happened on January 6th and things like that. So does that tie into what Hoffer was really talking about? And how would you see the sort of the Trump movement in that regard?
Well, I'm reminded of one of Hoffer's most famous lines, which is that mass movements can rise and spread without a God, but not without a devil. And the thing that ties together these white lives matter, shall we say, and patriots, or people who believe they're patriots and nobody else is the fact that they have particular enemies that they are railing against and that they believe that they're acting against. When you put the enemy outside of yourself, no matter who you are, it's always a problem for me. Because I tend to think that the strength of the United States is in its diversity, and that means in its acceptance of diversity, which is a very hard thing for many individuals to do. We're told that people are invading us from other countries. Well, the strength of this country has always been in its numbers of immigrants, and that they choose to come here, that they vote with their feet. And this is very, very important. It was certainly true in my parents' and grandparents' time, and it was before then as well, and it's still true today. I live in a small rural town where we have a lot of craftsmen, and when their sons are not wanting to go into their businesses, they are absolutely embracing some of the Latino people that come up here who are hard workers, who say, call me on Sunday, call me on a holiday, anytime, whatever you need, I'll be right there. And this is an American spirit. And this is something that Hoffer embraced. Hoffer said the best people in the world are what he called the deplorable, who are not there, who are no good, because he said, that's me. It's you too, but if you'll admit to it. But these are the people who built everything. So why throw them away?
And, you know, Tom, one of the words that Hoffer spoke about so much, and Dennis, you touched on this, he's talked about self-esteem. And that was one of the ways that people did not have self-esteem. They were more prone to join a mass movement. And Hoffer also talked about willingness to die. And Rory, that's where I see is a major difference. You can be part of a social movement. You're not a fanatic. You're not willing to die. Do you see it that way?
Well, we don't make the same distinctions really in terms of a mass movement and a social movement. I think there's a lot of commonality there, actually. There are people who are engaged in social movements who are certainly willing to put their lives on the line and have done so. A lot of people died in the civil rights movement. But
it's not fanatical the way you would say with ISIS, right?
That's true. And when you think about, I mean, the way I've looked at this, and I've studied the right-wing movements probably more than the progressive movements, is that, you know, we're acting based on, you know, the kind of information that we have available to us. And there just doesn't seem to be a particular personality type that's drawn into even the most extreme activism. So much of it has to do with who you're connected to and how you might be drawn into different types of political activity, extremist activity or less extreme activity by virtue of being drawn into a world and being connected to people who have a certain mindset. A lot of very normal people get drawn into movements that end up doing extreme things.
Well, and that's a question that I'd like to follow up on, because the violence issue is the question here. Obviously the mainstream media tends to focus on the violence, the white supremacists, Proud Boys, Boogaloo, the stuff that happened on January 6th, and rightfully so. They have a tendency, however, to overlook all of the violence that went on in Minneapolis and the stores that were burned, the police stations that were burned, Portland, Seattle. They overlook sort of your left-wing progressive things, Rory. But nevertheless, there's violence on both sides, and may not be appropriate, or I guess together is the same kind of violence. But does violence ever work? Is that a good strategy or a bad strategy, or how is that seen?
A lot depends on the particular circumstances. In a lot of cases, violence can generate a backlash. Public opinion can often be a really important factor that determines how much influence you can have. If the entire country is against you because you're portrayed as a violent organization, it's a much tougher haul to achieve your goals than would be the case otherwise. There are some instances, though, where violence has been like the only option available to some groups, and that's where some of the extremist organizations can be particularly dangerous when they have no voice, and they end up resorting to violence, seeing that as their only way of achieving any goals.
What are some of the political movements that have taken place, say, in the last, 3-5 years that have really impacted our culture?
I think certainly we've talked a lot about Black Lives Matter, but one of the things that has been really impressive to me is the movements on behalf of gay rights, LGBTQ rights, especially in terms of how rapidly public opinion has changed on some of these issues. We saw that in the case of same-sex marriage, where public opinion polls in terms of acceptance of LGBTQ rights from freedom of discrimination, but also more generally acceptance, has changed really quickly. And to me, that's a fascinating thing, because you don't normally see public opinion change that quickly.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. And Tom, the issue of, let's say, those social changes is one thing, but then we've got the flip side that is happening now, where we've got critical race theory, we've got cancel culture, et cetera. What do you think Hoffer would say about if he were sitting here on this program today about those issues?
Well, I can tell you what I'll say, which is more or less, I think what he would say is that our obligation is to understand and to accept, not to oppose just for the sake of opposing. I think cancel culture is an instance of something that's gone far too far on something that's generally not so terrible. It happened. Extremism creeps into almost every social movement on its fringes. The problem is that the people in the center are tarred with whatever it is that the people on the fringes are doing. This is always the problem when you march in a parade. You don't exactly know who's marching or who's going to be doing what when they're in front of the parade. You're in the middle of it because you believe in the general cause. So we're becoming more subject to the influence of extremists who have more means at their command to influence us. I think this is a problem that Hoffer would have liked to get his teeth into.
Rory, I'm going to take us in a different direction, and that is because you have been involved with so many organizations and movements. Are you seeing outside influence, in other words, from Russia or other countries? Can you give us a sense of any influence or impact that they've had on movements that you've observed closely?
No, that has often been kind of the response to try to discredit social movements. For example, the civil rights movement was accused by the FBI as being influenced by communists, and they actually spied on Martin Luther King. I mean, recently news reports do indicate that Russia was involved in trying to sway the election, spread misinformation through social media, but not in terms of social movements, but it's clearly a weapon that's often used to try to discredit social movements.
I think you've taught more than a decade, probably. How are you seeing students now? Are they more active than they were, say, 10 years ago?
Definitely, yes. They're more active and more knowledgeable. And there's also a really striking change in the way in which young people understand the world. And a lot of the views that seemed progressive to me maybe 20 or 30 years ago are now considered to be somewhat conservative. And there's new ways of thinking about issues and kind of keeping up with these changes. And for the most part, I think it's good. There are things that we have done for decades without fully appreciating the harm that we may be committing in doing them, and the way that we talk about things and the way that we think about things. But especially where I am, the students are remarkably involved, and they're fearful. They're fearful that the planet won't survive because of the environmental issues and a lot of other things that are taking place.
Well, that's not a good way to close, that they're fearful, but what is a good way is that you're optimistic and that they're engaged. And I want to thank both of you, Tom Shakman, Rory McVeigh, for being our guest today on the McCuistion Program. And let me remind our friends in our audience that you can always follow our program by going to McCuistionTV.com. Great way to catch up on past programs. Please share it with your social media. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and we'll be back very soon. Thanks again for watching.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email nickyn@nickymcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.